Yeah. I'd like to welcome those who are online with us. We'll be getting started in just a moment. So just bear with us for just a moment.
You want me to hand those out?
No, I'll give them this way.
Huh?
Let me make an announcement first. I'm only going to give them to those who want them. Just bear with us. We'll get started in just a moment. Just a moment. All right. I'll let everybody know we are live and online. Just so everybody knows. Line says we'll start at 10 a.m. Since we're doing, we'll just give it a. If anybody's watching, I just let them know we'll be starting in just a moment. I will ask this before we get started. Does anybody want an outline? I went ahead and made some outlines. They're not very detailed, but anybody want an outline of the class for today? Okay, so I'll start handing those out. And two down that way. There we go. You want one or two? You want two? Yeah. All right, see how many I got. All right, anybody else? All right. There we go. There we go. All right. Anyone else?
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
That's good, I can't hear.
All right. Any others? All right.
Are you feeling better?
I get better, but I just can't hear.
Huh?
I can't hear.
Huh?
All right. Anybody else like an outline of the class?
Anything for you, bro.
I didn't know what it would be like trying to lead a song.
It would be like the way you hear me sing. That's what it would be like.
All right. Let's see here. We'll go ahead and get started here in just a moment. Carson's going to lead a song before we go. All right, we'll go ahead and have a song led and start in.
Number 50. If you would, please turn in your songbooks to number 50.
Here. There you go.
We'll sing the first verse only of number 50. Let us sing. Days are filled with sorrow and care. Hearts are lonely and drear. Burdens are lifted at Calvary. Jesus is very near. Burdens are lifted at Calvary. Calvary, Calvary. Burdens are lifted at Calvary. Jesus is very near. Let's go to our classes.
So I'll have to make some more outlines for anybody else. We have two more outlines left. Anybody else want an outline? I have two left. All right. Actually, I have two. No, I have two left. There we go. Anyone else? Anybody? Anybody else? Anyone? All right, we're good. All right. Turning your Bibles with me to 2 Samuel. We'll be there in a moment. 2 Samuel chapter 7. 2 Samuel chapter 7. As we said, we are online this morning like we have been, and we're excited about that. We have our new camera working, so that's really great to know. And next week you won't see it stand here in front of me. It'll actually be hanging from the ceiling, so which will be good. You won't have to worry about that being there anymore. It'll be a little different. But we are in the process of still getting everything taken care of for the changes in the auditorium. Most things have been ordered. Most things have been received. We still got a few things we're waiting on. and get into the speaker system. And so say that. So I will say this: if I have you, if you read for us, this camera will pick you up now, which is great. The speaker's on it; it should pick you up. The microphone's on it; should pick you up from here, no matter where you are in the auditorium. So just to let you know that. It's not going to hear you whispering to somebody. Don't worry about that. But if you're making regular talks. But all right, 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel is where we'll be at. We left off last week as we're talking in the book of Psalms, and we're continuing with the book of Psalms. And as we look at the book of Psalm here, we've been talking about the 5 divisions that it has, and we know that we are in book 1. We did a kind of an introduction leading into book 1, and so this morning, as we continue with this area, book 1, kind of getting a very a quick introduction to book 1, meaning chapter 1 through 41. We'll finish up where I left off last week. That is not on your outline. We'll get into the outline when I get into where I planned on getting into last week today. So we'll do that. But just to remind us of 2 Samuel, we discussed a little about 2 Samuel. We read it. 2 Samuel chapter 7. I may have told you 2 Samuel. I may not have told you the chapter. 2 Samuel chapter 7 is where we're going to be at. And we're going to look at verses 11 through 14 again. 2 Samuel 7, 11 through 14. And here we see that David is going to be, basically, we understand that the Lord is speaking to David through the prophet Nathan. And he's speaking to him of the promises of things that would go on, things that would happen. And as we look at this, things that would take place later in the future. And as we look at this, we're going to see this word house mentioned. And I mentioned that very quickly last week. So I want to give a little more emphasis on that before we move on to this week's class. So 2 Samuel 7, if someone go and read for us, verses 11 through 14, that would be great. 2 Samuel 11, 11 through 14.
And since the time that I commanded judges to be over my people Israel, and have caused thee to rest from all thy enemies. Also the Lord telleth thee that he will make thee a house. And when thy days be fulfilled, and thou shalt sleep with thy fathers, I will set up thy seed after thee, which shall proceed out of thy bowels, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. If he commit iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men, and with the stripes of the children of men.
Thank you. So here, as we see this, he says, I will set up your seed after you, who will come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom, and he shall build a house. And here's this house. He says, for my name, and I will establish the throne, the kingdom forever. 2 Samuel 7:1 is what we would really, I mentioned last week, is what we call an ideological summit, meaning it's a summit piece that's very important about the history of the Old Testament, what was going to take place, and it would actually produce us forward to that of the New Testament. So as we look at this here, we see that there are these 2 opening psalms, basically we said Psalm 1 and 2, presented, as we know, in the condensed poetic fashion of what's going on throughout the Psalms here, is that David and Nathan, it gives us a lot of understanding of what's going on within these first 2 chapters. Remember, the main point here is that God's law, the contrary response of the 2 groups to that law, and also that the outworking of the consequences of their responses. So a lot was going on there, a lot was involved. But as we look at this is what I want to think about, is that the Lord's covenant in these Psalms that we discussed last week focus on the Davidic covenant with the Lord's 2 promises regarding family heritage, or we would say, the dynasty of a family. As we know, David had a big family and would go all the way through, of course, to the seed of Jesus. But we understand that there were a lot of problems in David's family. And so he's going to discuss this. But he's also going to discuss in that next chapter that we read in 2 Samuel about this dwelling place. Well, both these promises, are encapsulated in the key word house. And that's what it's all about here. In 2 Samuel, we read 7:11 that the Lord will make you a house. And then in verse 13, he says, he is the one who will build the house for my name. So the perpetual family heritage and dwelling place summarize basically the essential core of the Lord's covenant that he had with David. And I know that's a lot of information right there. And the reason I'm getting into that is because to understand these next chapters, chapters 1 through 41, we have to realize they're going to deal with a lot of things that are going on in the family of David. a lot of things that are going on in the house of David and how difficult it was for him during this time. Remember, he was king, but we know his throne is usurped, is taken from him, and we know certain things happen, and we know that David gets it back, and it's just a lot of turmoil. And if you remember when David, when Bathsheba got pregnant, and when Uriah was killed, what did God say about the sword with David's house? Anybody remember that? He said the sword's going to defend you all the time in your family. Is that what he said? Or is it more of the sword will never leave your house? In other words, there's going to be problems in your home. There's going to be problems in your house because of this decision, this choice that you made. Remember, did God forgive David for what he did?
Yes.
God forgave him, but are there still consequences?
Yes.
There are consequences at times, and we see this. Now, not all sins that we are a part of, we ask forgiveness, just like David, are there consequences, but a lot of them there are. And this is what we see happening with that taking place. So what else we want to really think about is that this family heritage is going to go through and things are going to be bad, but it's going to lead to the most important family, and that is the family of Jesus, and understand what we have through him. In fact, everyone turn over to Mark chapter 1, verse 1. I want us to realize as we think about this that we know that God, dwells on Mount Zion is what we were told, but at the same time, while he was, the throne, meaning there, that his throne was also in heaven. And it's kind of hard at times to get that, to kind of see God in that way, to understand he had a throne in Jerusalem and a throne in heaven. And it's because God can be where?
Everywhere.
Can God be everywhere all the time?
Yes.
He sure can. And we see it. And that's difficult for us, isn't it? Because, we know we can only be one place at one time, right? We go, well, I don't know about that anymore. Think about this. I'm right here with you right now, and so are you. But anybody else is at their home that's listening to us right now, is watching us. They're with us too. So we are actually in different places, and it's remarkable how the internet has made that available. There's a lot of bad things with the internet, but there's a lot of good to it also. Technology that is there. During the pandemic, during COVID, we know and understand that we were in areas all throughout the world online. And right now we can be anywhere at any time. But still, with that being the case, we are not God. And we need to get that. God can be anywhere and everywhere without technology. And because God is everything. And that's great to know. And this is what he really wants us to get at, is to understand that David is on his throne, but also God is on his throne. But we know later, of course, it'd be Jesus on his throne as we see over all this. And so why do I say that? Well, everyone look at Mark chapter 1, verse 1, if you're there. Someone go ahead and read that for us, because what I want us to get is that, I'll let you read, just say, is that Jesus the Christ, the anointed one, the Messiah, here it talks in Psalms about him in the New Testament. And that's what we want to understand. All these Psalms were written. They were written to give us the history, of course, of what took place in Israel, but also pushing us towards Jesus. It was always preparing the people for Christ. So Mark 1:1, what does it say? A very familiar verse. Someone go and read that for us. Mark 1:11. Simple verse, Mark 1:11.
There came a voice from heaven saying, Thou art thy beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased.
Thank you. So here at Jesus' baptism it says, You are my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. So guess what this alludes back to? Well, everyone look at Psalm 2:7 now. Hold on to that right there. And everyone look back at chapter 2, verse 7 of Psalm. And this is why we see this happening. Even the beginning of Jesus' ministry, we see the beginning of his baptism. We see the Spirit descending upon him as the form of a dove, it says. And we know, and it's really interesting, we see Jesus then start doing miracles and things taking place. We don't know of any miracles before that. We do know that he was full of knowledge, because who was he teaching at the age of 12? Yeah, the scribes, think about those priests that were in there, and his mom and dad forgot about him, and we know, and here he is, and he's talking to them like he has more, well, he does have more knowledge than they did at the age of 12. So we see that he had knowledge, and we know that because he is the Word, as we find that understanding. But here we see this happening, and this is alluding back to chapter 2, verse 7. Someone go and read chapter 2, verse 7, where we find here of Jesus saying, God saying this, or Psalmist saying this.
I will declare the decree, the Lord hath said unto me, Thou art my Son, this day have I begotten thee.
Thank you. So it's basically the same thing. It's exactly what we see was being alluded back to. Also Isaiah chapter 42 verse 1. Remember, son is a title that basically transcends the messiahship. Messiahship is Jesus is the Son of God. You know, the Son of God, he's deity. But here we find the Son of God. It denotes a very unique relationship between God and the Father and Jesus, his Son. It's just like any parent with their child. There is a unique relationship that is going there. So what the Father is basically showing us is that in Mark 1:11, Jesus was chosen for a very special, specific task. But what I want you to get to understand is this was nothing new. There was nothing that was set up at the last minute. It was talked about all the way back in Psalm chapter 2. So we understand that Jesus was always into the future to come about as a person on this earth. Which brings us to Acts chapter 4. Everyone turn over there with me. I want you to notice Acts chapter 4 for just a moment. Acts chapter 4. And you can hold Psalm 1 and 2 because we'll keep going back and forth to there. But in Acts chapter 4, we see Peter and John after being jailed. So they're being jailed here. And it's interesting that they're threatened by the Sanhedrin that basically if you preach or teach anything in the name of Jesus, we're gonna lock you up. And guess what they're going to quote from? Anybody got an idea? Psalm. They're going to quote from Psalm chapter 2. And remember, once again, Psalm chapter 1 and chapter 2 are what we talked about. Remember, the entrance into the book of Psalms. Everything with it that is there. And how important it is. So here we see in Acts chapter 4. Let's look at Acts chapter 4 and begin here in verse 23. Someone go ahead and read for us. Acts 4, 23 through 28. And you're going to see in verse 25 and 26 the actual quote from Psalm 2, 1 and 2. Someone go and read it for us, please.
And being let go, they went to their own company and reported all that the chief priests and elders had said unto them. And when they heard that, they lifted up their voice to God with one accord and said, Lord, thou art God, which hast made heaven and earth and the sea and all that in them is, who by the mouth of thy servant David hath said, why did the heathen rage and the people imagine vain things? The kings of the earth stood up, and the rulers were gathered together against the Lord and against his Christ. For truth against thy holy child Jesus, whom thou hast anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, with the Gentiles and the people of Israel, were gathered together, for to do whatsoever thy hand and thy counsel determined before to be done.
Thank you. So here, here we see that they're very clear about this. We find that Peter and John say, you are the ones that set up these other men, these rulers here. But look what he does. Why do you think they quote from chapter 2, 1 and 2? What would be the purpose for it? What are they trying to prove? What are they wanting everybody to understand that the Jews just could not seem to get? Especially the hierarchies. That Jesus was who he said he was. That he was the Son of God. And look what they're doing. They're saying, they make it very clear. Look at the things you're doing. Exactly what was said in the Psalms would happen is exactly what's happening right now. And, we go, okay, if it's one or two things, maybe 10 things, say, all right, so possibly they could just pick things out of the Old Testament and say, yeah, this applies to here, this applies to that. But when you have hundreds of different prophecies coming true in the life of Jesus to him, how could it not point to him truly being the Son of God? It's just infallible to think that number would ever happen just with anybody. And we know that's not the case. So very important. Turn to Ephesians chapter 6. I want you to look at Ephesians chapter 6 because we'll come back and talk about this in just a moment. Ephesians chapter 6. We know that here we see the idea in Psalm 2 as a cosmic battle. That's what Psalm 2 is about. It's about a battle that's taking place in the background, behind everything. And the Lord is played out as the person who would beat Satan, win against Satan, and just demolish him in all ways. And we know this is the case. Well, people nowadays, they think in the first century, and even today, they think, well, those kind of things don't happen. It's just you and I, that's all there is. Let me ask you this. Do you think there's angels? I was pointing out, angels is a sticky subject when we start getting, what I mean, do you think God created angels?
Yes.
Yeah, how do we know that?
Created everything.
What's that?
He created everything.
He created everything. And does the Bible tell us God created angels? It does. It talks about them. Now, when we look at this, we think today, we go, okay, angels are gone out of the picture. You think angels are completely gone? What I mean by that, you think God said, all right, there's a time and place where I'm going to destroy all the angels. No. What I'm trying to say is there is something going on in the background, and that's what we see about this. And this is this battle that he talks about. And some people will try to read Ephesians 6:12 and say, oh, it's just figurative. It's just a figurative thing because he's talking about our armor and watching out. No, it's not a figurative thing, and we need to get that. There's a lot of figurative language in the book of Revelation, but this in Ephesians 6:12 that Paul tells us, he's saying these things are happening, and he does it by talking about what was happening in the book of Psalms to remind all those people that this is nothing new. Someone go ahead and read for us there. Ephesians 6, verse 12.
For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against power, against the ruler of the darkness and of the world, against spiritual weaknesses is in high places.
Thank you. So some verses say heavenly places. And so that would be remember, the Jews looked at, when we say heavenly places, the reason they would say heaven, because the Jews saw three heavens. That's what they always refer to. And a lot of times you'll see them use it plural, because heaven was, you have the sky, then you had the stars, then you had finally where God is at. And that's how that's what they would refer to those. So here we see in these heavenly places. Now we know during the first century, were there evil spirits and so on about? We know there were. Things were going on. And so some will try to say, well, that's all Ephesians 6 is applying to, only to during that time. I wanted to show you something. Do you think verse 11 applies to us today? Do you think verse 11 applies to you and I, or only to those in the first century? It applies to us just well, because look at that verse. Put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. Okay, so he makes that point. Then he tells us where the wiles of the devil is, the things that are happening and going on. Do you think the devil is in a battle to steal your soul? Yes. Absolutely, every single day. Do you think Jesus is in a battle? And it talks about here, look at once again here what it says. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, against principalities, against powers, against rulers of darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness. You think Jesus is in a battle to say, hey, I don't care what you're going to try to do. I'm going to defeat you because they're going to follow me. And if they follow me, they will defeat you. Do you think he's willing to battle for us? Yes. He did battle for us, didn't he? And that's what Psalms is about. We see here Psalms is telling us in chapter 1, that remember what's going on with David and the nation. Then in chapter 2, you have that personal feeling, everything that's going on with your life. And he makes it very clear that Jesus won by going to the cross and was resurrected. But that doesn't mean it's over. See, this is the point I'm trying to make. People all the time will say, once Jesus is resurrected, there's nothing else you need to do. You're good to go for the rest of your life. Why would Paul, in Ephesians chapter 6, so many years later, mention these kind of words? Because we see the devil is still trying to get our soul. And he's trying to. In fact, a lot of times we say the devil doesn't have any power. What have I told you? The Bible says very clearly the powers of the devil. It talks about his powers. And we understand. And it's meaning he has so much influence over people in the world that even back in Psalm chapter 1 and 2, David was dealing with it. And we see that we are still dealing with it today. So as action against the Lord and his anointed one was futile in the time of David, so it is against Jesus and the Messiah and all of his followers during the first century, during the second century, during the third century, all the way today to the 21st century, which takes us to Acts 13. Yes, Mom?
The devil's working hard on the Christians. He already has the people in the world.
Yep.
So we're the ones that have to really watch.
Yeah, that's exactly right. See, what the devil will do is he will use the world to influence Christians. He will use the world to influence Christians. But at the same time also, there are those who are on the, they're right there on the fence. They're trying to decide, do I follow God? Do I not? And how hard do you think the devil's working on them? We ever heard the word overtime? Anybody ever worked overtime before? Well, late into the night. I mean, it's like, that's how he is. And that's what we see, which brings us to Acts 13. Thank you for the comment. Acts 13, let's look at it for just a moment. Acts chapter 13, I want you to see here Paul. Paul is speaking to Pisidian of Antioch, and he wants them to understand the importance here of basically realizing that these things take place. And in Acts 13, someone go and read for us. We're going to look at 32 and 33, 32 and 33. And he's going to show us here, it's interesting, once again, he's going to quote from 2 Psalm. Now remember what I said about 2 Psalm. What's the most quoted psalm in the New Testament? Psalm 2. Psalm 2, 2 Psalm. So someone go ahead and read this for us, 32 and 33.
And we declare unto you glad tidings, how that the promise which was made unto the fathers, God hath fulfilled the same unto us their children, in that he hath raised up Jesus again, as it is also written in the 2nd Psalm, Thou art my son, this day I have begotten thee.
Thank you. So it's interesting. Remember, we see this 2nd Psalm in this section going all the way back to Jesus' baptism. And now we find here, without a doubt, that Luke writing this is reminding us that, hey, this is what's happening. And Peter telling us and talking about this, the importance with it, which takes us right to Romans 1. Everyone look at Romans 1. Romans 1 goes right along with it, and it's an important area to look here. Romans chapter 1. And I want us to notice here verses 1 through 4. And Paul, once again, Paul here is now talking, beginning a letter to the Romans, and he wants to declare to them who Jesus is. Remind them of who he is, but remind them that, look, I know that most Romans here are Gentiles, but realize this is not a new concept, Christianity. Christianity was thought of in the beginning and would come about through Christ when he came to this earth. Someone go and read Romans 1, 1 through 4.
Paul, the servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, separated unto the gospel of God, which he had promised afore by his prophets in the Holy Scriptures, concerning his Son Jesus Christ our Lord, which was made of the seed of David according to the flesh, and declared to be the Son of God with power according to the Spirit of the holiness, by the resurrection from the dead.
Thank you. So who did Jesus come through? The seed of David. And this is important to see once again. It brings us back to Psalm 1 and 2. But notice the verse 2, which he promised before through, as Brother Carson wrote, through his prophets and the Holy Scriptures, in the Holy Scriptures. So a lot of times people say, yeah, the prophet said this, but maybe the Bible's not right. Notice what he said, the prophets in the Holy Scriptures. So he's trying to show us what you're reading is exactly what these prophets talked about and said, that this would come through Christ. Which brings us to the book of Corinthians. Everyone turn over in your Bibles with me to 2 Corinthians. All I'm trying to show here this morning is to describe and let us understand how the New Testament is so involved with the Old Testament. In fact, I've said it several times in my life. You will not understand the New Testament unless you know the Old Testament. You have to, it doesn't mean you need to know the Old Testament in and out, but we have to study the Old Testament and realize. And what's interesting, if we study the Psalms, if we do a good study, which we're going to do through this class of Psalms, there is no reason why anything in the New Testament you would not understand. Because the Psalms declares it. That's what's remarkable when you look at that book. Which brings us to 2 Corinthians chapter 6. Someone go ahead and read for us 2 Corinthians chapter 6 as we look at verses 16 and 18. 16 through 18.
And what agreement hath the temple of God with idols? For ye are the temple of the living God. As God has said, I will dwell in them and walk in them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Wherefore come out from among them, and be ye separate, saith the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you, and will be a father unto you, and ye shall be my sons and daughters, saith the Lord Almighty.
Thank you. So here, once again, we find here that the experiences with David, the experiences with Jesus, bring us to the experience of all of God's children, sons and daughters. He makes it very clear here. And he wants us to realize that these things were talked about, these other prophets. Here you have Isaiah speaking. You have areas of Leviticus in here, Ezekiel. You have just so many different areas being spoken of. And they're all referencing basically what David would be talking about throughout the rest of these Psalms in Psalms 141. So David's experiences, as I said, what they do is they prototype. They're a prototype of the experiences every Christian will follow. Comes back to that house. Why? Because it says we are the temple. We are the temple that David, here it is, desired to build. A lot of times we think the temple he desired to build was the physical one that his son Solomon built. And that was true. But when it comes to spiritual sense of really understanding, he's talking about the church. And who's the church? It's this building on the hill, right? Who's the church? I hear people saying, we are the people, Christians. See, God has built us. All this I got to get to here has built us into a house of his own where he, here it is. Remember what I said, you have the house, the family, and then the dwelling. So here we understand that he built a house into where he forever dwells. Forever dwells. The temple that was built for the Jews, what happened to it? It was demolished, destroyed. What was destroyed with it? Think about what was the most important thing for a Jew? To be able to trace their what? Their lineage. To be able to trace what tribe they came from, right? Because the tribe told you what you were going to do, who you were part of, what you were doing. Guess what was destroyed with the temple? All that. And over time, people forgot. They couldn't trace their lineage anymore. You wonder, why did God allow that to happen? To understand. Because the people were becoming too involved, which they did even during the time of Jesus, with the physical. Everything was physical. Even though that's the way the Jewish way was set up, but they were supposed to also think about the spiritual and then get to that point. That's why when Jesus came to this earth, what did they look at him as? What did they want him to do? They wanted him to set up an earthly kingdom and rebuild the what? What do you think he wanted them to rebuild?
The temple.
The temple. Well, guess what Jesus said? I am building a temple that is not made with hands that will last forever. And what was that temple? It's the church. And guess what the Bible talks about our bodies being? The temple of God. Christians, that's what it's all getting back to as we see this. Therefore, using Paul's perspective as a template, as we look at here, we can apply the various truths of the Psalms to our lives. Here it is. Yes, David went through more than we will likely ever go through. I mean, ever go through. He went through so much, and he was a unique individual raised up as a man after God's own heart, is what we're told. So a person after God's own heart. And in order to display in all its fullness the glorious life of the greater David, Jesus in turn, here it is, experienced the realities described in the Psalms in a further unique and even, we would say, heightened manner than David did. So the assumption is this. Underlying these Psalms is that one man's experience of God is for all of us. For all of us. What David experienced, we experience. What Jesus experienced, we experience. Because David's experience was Christ's experience, and David and Christ's experience is our experience. That's what the Bible shows us. That's what Psalm 1 and 2 is wanting us to understand. That when we deal with things, whether difficulties, whether excitements, whether happy moments, sad moments, whatever it is, go to Psalm 1 and 2. And when you read it, you will think of what David went through, you will think of what Jesus went through, and you will see why we are going through what we go through. And that's what's described. All right, any comments or questions? Everyone's like, where is that in my outline? It was nowhere. Now we got to the outline, finally. So that was last week. That was trying to catch up, and I was a little behind. So here we're going to look at basically closely at book 1, Psalm 1 through 41. We're going to continue looking a little closer. That was basically Psalm 1 and 2. We're going to get into 3 now. Like I said, the beginning here in Psalm book 1, I'm going to spend probably more time than any of the other books, because it really does help us and allow us to understand where we're headed at throughout this study. Book 1, as we said, of the Psalms traces, we said, the path of David, the rise to the throne through many afflictions, reflecting the conflict that we saw in the opening 2 Psalms. And we know that these Psalms largely describe the period of David's life when he was God's anointed one, was confronted by his enemies. So that's what this is really dealing with. Everything David was going through by his enemies. And all of them, but except for chapter 10 and chapter 33. So everything but those 2 chapters, we understand, are attributed to David. And they reveal basically David's personal struggle. Here it is. This is why we need to understand it. In this cosmic battle. When I say cosmic, we think back to Ephesians 6:12. We think about this battle that's taking place in the background for your soul. Is exactly what we saw here as we talked about there with David. So why did David have such a large role, do you think, in the production of the Psalms? Anybody have an idea? Why do you think David has such a large role in the production of the Psalms? What did we find about David in his younger years, first of all? What was something that he did a lot of and he really enjoyed it? Music. He loved music. He loved playing before Remember the King. He loved doing this with others. Could you just see him? Could you see him as a shepherd out there just singing along, just singing and just having a good old time and saying a good old time while he's watching, over the sheep. I could just see David being involved in that. He was a very poetic man, very, very poetic. He wrote a lot of poetry, and that's with all these Psalms that he wrote. But we understand, when we look at these, that most of these Psalms that he wrote them in the first person. So it wasn't like he was writing this could happen or this could happen. He wrote exactly what was taking place. David's first person, though, addresses to God, is the Psalm should be understood in the terms of the Old Testament redemptive history with God, with God and David. The reason he wrote so many is because Saul, we wonder, why isn't there more about Saul? Saul was a king that was chosen by the who? I want you to think about this. Who was Saul chosen by? The people. He wasn't chosen by God. And we need to get this. But once the people got stuck on a king, God's like, fine. Saul has become a bad king, a terrible king. I knew he was going to be like this. I will anoint the next king. Even when Saul was king, was David anointed? So, now God had already told Saul, said, your kingdom is ripped from you. It's done. You're not going to have it anymore. But he went against God, rebelled, and continued to be king. But at that time, we know David was actually the only king known by God. But at the same time, guess what it allowed David to do? It allowed him to experience a lot, to learn, to become stronger, to become better. He was already a person of God, a man of God after his own heart, without a doubt, even at a young age. But with age, the older we get comes what? Something that Solomon asked for. Wisdom. David needed some learning moments, didn't he? He needed some wisdom, and that's what David was going to do. He was going to grow up during this time. We look at that and we think, why didn't God just have somebody kill Saul right away? Because David needed to experience things. He needed to experience things to become the king that he was going to become. He needed to know that he could rely on David, but also, here it is, that the people could rely on David as a man of God, not just as a warrior. Because remember, what was he under Saul? What type of person was he? He was a warrior, wasn't he? I mean, he was a fighting man. He went out, and when he would go out and slaughter all these other places, he'd come out, and the people, remember, said about thousands would sing Saul's name, but how many sung David's? Tens of thousands. The more that happens, usually when you get more and more people start yelling for you, screaming for you, what can your head start to do? It's like, yeah, that's me. That's my name I'm hearing out there. God needed David to experience some things to go through. And this is what happens with David. He does that. And it makes him a better man. It makes him a better king. And we know that he had a lot of problems, had a lot of struggles, but we see that the Psalms are going to show us, which brings us to Psalm number 3. Everyone turn to Psalm number 3. Let's see how much time I got. All right, we're going to have about 10 minutes in this class. All right, Psalm chapter 3. Psalm chapter 3. And we're going to look at this as we basically an example of which we understand here these emotions, these experiences that come through David, come through Jesus, come to us. And it's going to be found, all of this in chapter is going to be found in the fellowship that's found in Christ. And brethren, we know that we have to have fellowship in Christ. David had to have fellowship in Christ. And we go, how could David have fellowship in Christ? Because he was told there was going to be a son of God. They all knew this. And one day this would happen. So here we go in Psalm chapter 3, is that on one level it is David describing the tragic situation of chapter 3 of what happened between him and his son, Absalom. Now remember, at this point, David's already king. He's been king for a while. Absalom is David's son. What did he do? Anybody remember what Absalom did? Did he say, hey, Dad, why don't you give me your kingdom? Is that what he did? He rose up against his father and took the throne. And did David say, all right, I'll just go ahead and let you have the throne. Let me live in the background. What did David have to do? Did anybody remember 2 Samuel 15? He had to flee. Why did he have to leave? He was afraid of his what? Someone's going to kill him. He was afraid of this. Exactly. I mean, it was going to be really bad. This is the sword that was in David's house now. This is what was happening. So this is not just a cry. This is what we need to understand. When we read Psalm 3, some people read it as an individual cry from David. This is not just an individual cry from David with family problems. This is what happens to David, and when it impacts the king, who does it impact? The entire kingdom. Everybody. We see that in our own country, don't we? We see in our own country with leaders. We know that without a doubt. So chapter 3, I don't want to read the whole chapter. We're going to come back and forth through little pieces of it. So we're going to go to the bottom part first. Everyone's like, that's a weird way to start a chapter. I'll agree, but that's how we're going to do it. Go ahead and look at verse 7. We're going to look at verse 7 here. Let's go ahead and read verse 7 through verse 8. 7 and 8. Someone read that for us, please.
Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for thou hast smitten all mine enemies upon the cheekbone. Thou hast broken the teeth of the ungodly. Salvation belongeth unto the Lord, thy blessings upon thy people.
So, thank you. So does this sound like somebody is, well, it's David, as we know, save me. It sounds like he's crying for help. It sounds like he's crying for help at first, but then what does it sound like he says also at the end of that? What is happening? I know I cry out for help because that's what we're supposed to do when we need help, but I also know what about God? That he's there to help in times of need, and he will. So as we see this Psalm 3, we notice David's reference to the Lord's, I think I just said David's reference to the Lord, I didn't mean it like that, being a shield. And I want you to think back once again to Ephesians chapter 6. How did it say we beat this cosmic, these things in the background? What did it say we're supposed to take the whole what? Armor of God in verse 11. And is the shield one of them? Without a doubt. And notice how David's going to reference basically a shield. Everyone look at verse 3 here. Everyone look at verse 3 of chapter 3. And it says, but you, O Lord, are a shield for me, my glory, and the one who lifts up my head. So without a doubt, we understand that God, the Lord, is a shield to David. Does the Lord shield you and I today? Think about this. Definitely, without a doubt. Did the Lord shield Jesus? When I say Lord, did God the Father ever shield Jesus? You think Jesus needed help being shielded? Think about it. He was God on earth, but he was still a what on earth?
A man.
He was a human being. He was a human being on earth. Was Jesus, God on earth, susceptible to temptation just like we are?
Yes.
Without a doubt. He was. Did he fall into temptation though?
No.
No. Do you remember with, and I'm going to look at a few things here. Do you remember with, and I'm going to come back to Jesus, with God and Satan, when Satan came to God and he asked about Job? He asked about Job. And, he was looking for somebody to basically, cause a problem with. And God basically asked him, said, you ever thought about my follower, Job? And what did the devil say about Job? Anybody remember?
Yeah, he's okay because he's rich and got all this money and all these animals and all this land and everything. If he had bad times fall upon him, we'll see how faithful he is to you.
That's exactly right. Remember he said he had go ahead, Doug.
Said he had a hedge put around, God put a hedge around him.
Put a hedge around him. That's exactly right. And that's basically what he was talking about, the hedge and all that. In other words, the devil said he is what? That word, the word you would say untouchable. He's untouchable. And what did God say for him to go ahead and try to do? Go and touch him. Go ahead. Go ahead and do it. Because the reason God did this, because Job knew he had a shield in God. It wasn't that God knew he had a shield, therefore when we say a hedge, meaning, yeah, God had been taking care of Job because Job had been a follower of God. But God knew the heart of Job. Job knew who God was and relied on him as shield. But I don't believe Job knew he was as strong as he really was. Even his own wife told Job to do what? Curse God and die. I mean, can you imagine that? It's like nothing's going right for you. Everything's happening. But when he stayed with the shield, what happened in the end? He was blessed even beyond what he had. If the devil thought he had a hedge then, imagine now. I mean, we see that. But what Jesus, and this is what the devil's trying to say. Oh, yeah, you won't let me go over here. Does God treat us like robots and say, I'm not going to let that happen to you? If you decide to let the devil touch you, that's what's going to happen. God allows those things. But at the same time, he says, if you say, I don't want the devil on me, I don't want him around me, that shield's going to protect us. And that's what we see here. So this is what's getting at here. David knew that he had a shield. But even though David had a shield, how many problems did he have? A lot. How many times did he get hurt, you think? A lot. physically and mentally. We see that happening. Which brings us to Genesis 15 before we close. That's it. Let's read Genesis 15. We'll close here. I want us to think back in Genesis chapter 15. Think about for just a moment to Abraham. And we have to see this and we'll close. Genesis chapter 15. And I'll just read this real quick. It should remind us of God's covenant promised to Abraham. And when we think of a shield, this is what David is getting at, just like we should all get at. He's talking about the covenant that we have with God. It says, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision saying, do not be afraid, Abram. Guess what he says to him? I am your, anybody see it? Shield. Your exceedingly great reward. See, Abram was afraid to leave his country. What was going to happen to him, what was going to take place, and he's getting with Pharaoh, these other Egyptians, everything that's taking place, these kings. And God says, don't be concerned. You're proving that you're a follower of me. I am your shield. All you have to do, just like a shield, what happens? Here's your shield. Everything's good. What happens if you drop that shield and you walk over here? You're no longer what? You're no longer shielded. We have to keep God as our front and Christ as our front, always as our shield. All right, that's all we got. Any comments or, I almost said suggestions. Any comments or questions before we close? All right, that's it. All right, we'll go ahead and close out. Thanks. Appreciate it.